exciting sort of lineup of speakers here today for you. I'm going to start off with setting the scene a bit. You've got the agendas on your tables. First of all, I would very much like to thank Hazlewoods, who's sponsored this event for us. It's also sponsored by DEFRA. Sorry, hang on, there we go. I will get there in a moment. Sorry. I'm just going to put the agenda up for you, hopefully. So you've got the agenda on the table. It's always the way, isn't it? You have it working perfectly and then it doesn't work the way you want it to. Perfect. Thank you. So we've got the agenda on the table. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to try, if it's possible, oh hi Chris, I'm going to try, if it's possible, to set the context of where we are at the moment with future farming support. And Charles Mann has very kindly tasked me with trying to make this very simple. And so I spent most of last evening and quite early this morning trying to work out how on earth to make this simple, but I will try and explain that. So I'm going to give you sort of 10 minutes of that to start off with. Then we're very lucky to have Rachel Lenane from the Climate and Nature Fund of Gloucestershire, who's going to do the main presentation around biodiversity net gain. And then we've got Andrew, who's going to talk to us about a case study that he's done on his farm in the Forest of Dean. And then we've got Nicholas, who's going to talk to us about potential tax implications. So hopefully, if my computers work, that it's okay to feel confused right now about what's going on in the support mechanisms for farming. It's so complicated at the moment for us as advisors, people who are going out on farms to make decisions. And what I'm going to try and do is give you a 10-minute snapshot of where we are in relation to my understanding. And having been on the ELMS engagement group for nearly 6.5 years, having some pretty bold statements from DEFRA last week about their steer now for ELM and where that's going, about the local developing mechanisms around biodiversity net gain, around the national carbon sort of objectives we've been leading on as well around soil farm carbon. How all this is going to fit together has not yet been defined. So if you feel confused at the moment, then please don't worry, because it is not a clear picture. And it's very difficult when you've got multiple different evolving mechanisms. So today we're going to focus on biodiversity net gain, because we sort of know a bit about biodiversity net gain. This is really what I'm hoping to sort of give you some sort of grounding around, and how this event sort of is trying to fit with some clarity around biodiversity net gain, because that has the potential to complement or displace other mechanisms. So we have to make sure that we're aware when we're creating opportunities for habitat restoration on our farms, we're not missing opportunities, and that we're choosing the right tools and vehicles to be able to make sure we can get the best opportunities as they're evolving. If it's a bit small, I do apologise, I will talk. And if anyone at the back can't see well, do feel free to move forward. The bit that's really exciting to me is I'm lucky enough to be involved in some of the sort of global developments and initiatives that are actually happening. I'm particularly involved with the idea of a global sustainability metric. And I don't know how many of you heard of the Terra Carta. How many people have heard of the Terra Carta and the Task Force for Agribusiness? So this is an international ambition set forward by His Royal Highness the King to actually create a sustainability metric around the way that we invest in our future, for making sure that there's not climate or nature negativity in any of those investments. And that's actually linking into some really high level, I try not to get too drawn into the complexity, but there's a lot of high level ambition that you could release all these huge pension funds if we can create a sustainability standard that is globally acceptable. So the Task Force for Nature Financial Disclosure and the Task Force for Climate Nature Disclosure. That means that we can end up potentially having an opportunity to have a standard by which we can enable investment to take place that isn't nature or climate depleting. Why that's relevant to us here in Gloucestershire is that we're doing, and we're hoping you'll be part of that, the ground truthing of those tests and trials and sustainability metric that are linked directly to those global developments. So Adele Jones and Patrick Holden were at COP27 presenting this, And our trial that we're doing here in Gloucestershire is actually what the Sustainable Food Trust and others are using to explore this metric. So we also want to try and explain around the sort of like how there is a complexity around the trajectory of spatial targeting that is complicated at the moment, and because obviously we now understand that ELM is mostly going to be built out from countryside stewardship. We have countryside stewardship targeting and other targets that come from our government agencies that exist, that underpin the existing schemes that we have. But we also have the development of biodiversity net gain and carbon markets, which effectively will have, in the interim, before the development of the local nature recovery strategies, will have interim maps that will be adopted by local authorities such as the Nature Recovery Network, which I'll explain a bit more in a minute. So we think, and what we're trying to do here in Gloucestershire, is to be a national sort of case study for the county about localised solutions. So we're working absolutely with our district councils, our county councils, our catchment partnerships, and trying to find out how we can build resilient opportunities for nature recovery in our county that aligns and creates mechanisms that you can benefit from, that align to these wider ambitions of investment and global sustainability. So we'll talk a little bit about that later, but not too much because it gets quite complicated. But what we really need to do, and what the ELM trial is trying to do, our environmental land management trial, is to help you get that environmental baseline and sustainability standard. Because as farmers, the one thing that we know, and we've now been saying this for nearly 2 or 3 years, is that you need to have that baseline. And some of you may have already got it. You may have done carbon audits, you may have had your own natural capital assessments done, you may have had them done by us. But we want to invite you to be part of our trial so that we can actually make sure that you get those baselines. And those baselines can go back to January 2020, and we can help understand how that is. So we're trying to look at how we can not only make sure that you get that baseline accounted for and recorded, but it's designed in a way that actually feeds into the development of strategies across the county and wider strategic ambitions. So just for your own information, if you haven't looked at the Terra Carta, it's actually sort of basically it's a really I would say building opportunity for lots of big private businesses to get behind. So they have sort of global companies that are signing up to this. As I say, the pension funds are now being asked to look at how they financially disclose, as I say, against the task force for financial and climate financial disclosure and nature disclosure. So it really is this alignment that I'm hoping that you can see that we are hopefully leading the opportunity that rather than there being, trillions of pounds worth of pension funding money that's out there sort of floating around, actually not being able to be invested because the projects aren't big enough or the sustainability standards aren't in place yet, to actually be able to aggregate landscapes to become benefits of those investors as well as the other mechanisms that we're talking about. So I'm only going to do 2 more slides and I'm going to hand over to Rachel. But I just thought it might be useful for you, and you may not be able to read this at the back, so I will be able to say so. So what we know so far at the moment today, and I have to be polite because DEFRA is having a copy of this film, so effectively we're all very grateful to DEFRA. The Sustainable Farm Incentive is going to stay for now, we think, and we don't know how much more further development that's going to have with the standards. What we do know is the Sustainable Farm Incentive currently on .gov says that you can have voluntary carbon markets on top of that, but it hasn't said how. And you don't know whether those carbon investors will be happy with that yet, but just be aware that there does seem to be some synergy that DEFRA is trying to do to not crowd out carbon markets. Countryside stewardship, we now know, is after 6.5 years of calls, we were all quite devastated on the ELMS engagement group when it was released to us about 10 days ago, 2 weeks ago, that actually they're going to go back to countryside stewardship to build out ELM, which is something I've actually been saying for a long time, that it will end up like ELM. It will end up like countryside stewardship. But they're trying to work out how to do the add-ons with all the private finance and all the other mechanisms. So we do know that biodiversity net gain is being progressed by local planning authorities, which is why we think this is a really important point, because these are real-time opportunities developing, around all of which this has an impact and a knock-on in the architecture. And that we know currently that BNG can't be stacked with carbon at the moment, but Rachel may explain later there may be a legacy for your BNG in 20, 30 years' time that you might then be able to take carbon then unless it's inbuilt, and maybe others in the room can explain a bit more about their views on that. And that there is ongoing development of ecosystem markets across whole spectrums of phosphate, nitrate, carbon markets developing around habitat types, all sorts of stuff that's happening, and I'm lucky enough to be involved with something called the UK Ecosystems Policy Advisory Group. And the one thing that I've tried to get people to understand or benefit the collaboration of this development of these different schemes is to have a common framework by which they all interface with each other. So we, in our ELMS trial 1 and 2, we're using a new classification system for our habitats, which is called the UK Habitat Classification, which hopefully some of you will be familiar with now. It's a brilliant hierarchical classification system, very easy to assess habitats with it and get the resolution that you need of detail. It also has management codes on your land so that you can have proxy measures for how your land is measured for delivering ecosystem services. So UK Habitat Classification is already the foundation for biodiversity net gain assessments. So it makes sense for us, if we're having other developing markets, to actually link these together using UK Habitat Classification. So today our focus is biodiversity net gain, but we're already seeing the development and a lot of investment through things like central ecology and hydrology around this idea that these secondary codes can actually be proxy measures for ecosystem services that's coming from your land, like water holding, water quality, ecological recovery, air quality, those sorts of services, food, fibre, fuel. But also we want to make sure that if there is a development of carbon codes, that they interface and have the same underpinning architecture, so that they can actually make sure that we don't have lots of different maps with using lots of different systems. So just to finish off, so we have today, to summarise what I've sort of tried to do as the introduction, we know we need an environmental baseline. We've started off with this idea that we're going to map the land using UK Hab as part of our ELMS trials. We know there's enormous opportunity for people to act on climate emergency. People want to do something and they want to do it now. So we have to give an opportunity to release that social capital and enable people to feel valued and contributory. We're exploring today, the development of biodiversity net gain and how that's playing out in our county. And as I say, different counties trialling and learning from each other. And we're at the evolution of nature recovery networks into local nature recovery strategies. We're already delivering for payments for ecosystem services for water companies and doing a lot of natural flood management. There's a whole exploration around carbon and carbon trading, and obviously the bit that really interests me is the green finance and releasing a lot of finance, because I don't think in the current state that we're in that the government will have the finance to be able to invest what we need for rapid climate adaptation, but there is an opportunity for that investment to happen if we align through the matrix that we're talking about. So my final slide is just to set the scene for Rachel, and we'll come back and talk a bit more about this later, but is to say that in Gloucestershire we have our Nature Recovery Network map. We have, through our local nature partnership and economic partnership, the ecosystem attribution has been tied to that through sort of consultant analysis. We can value the land use for economic purposes to see how land use change can have an economic value, which gives it a value. This map is live, but please be aware if you Google on it, it's an advisory map. It's actually for interpretation. But it is the starting point, and as Rachel will tell you, of where they're going to start to focus their attention for biodiversity net gain. So I just thought, I know it's a lot of information and I do apologise, and I'm not sure how much I simplified it, but please be aware there are multiple different organisations and discussions going on within our county that cross-cut across our economic partnership, our nature partnership, our climate leadership group, our district councils that declare climate emergencies. All of the funding that's coming down from national government, we're trying to funnel that down to the ground to create investment-ready projects that feed into this opportunity for co-investment. And we feel that the way that we're working here has an opportunity to demonstrate to DEFRA that actually creating some of these sort of broad and shallow, high-level national national sort of mechanisms isn't actually going to be that relevant to us anymore, and they'll be part of the sort of the metric of things we can facilitate. But there are other things coming on board that we need to be aware of. So I'm going to hand over to Rachel now. Thank you.
So I'm Rachel Lenane, and I'm the manager for the Gloucestershire Nature and Climate Fund. So I'm going to be talking about biodiversity net gain, what it is, and how you can start up your own biodiversity net scheme, perhaps working with GNCF. So just setting the scene then, Gloucestershire's natural environment currently provides around £500 million per year in terms of value for its local residents, in terms of recreation in natural green space, improvements to water quality, air pollution reductions, and so on. But despite this, out of all the countries in Europe, UK has lost the most of its biodiversity, and Gloucestershire has lost 97% of its species-rich grasslands since World War II. And there is a current UK funding gap of around £56 billion towards where we are now versus where we want to be in the nature restoration targets that the UK government has set. So in response to this, we have the Environment Act, which gained royal assent in 2021, and part of that is this requirement for all developers to have at least a 10% biodiversity net gain on their land. And this is a real massive step forward, I think, in nature conservation policy. I'm really pleased to see this actually coming into force. So it's now enshrined in UK law, and we're already starting to see it come through. So biodiversity net gain has been written into local planning policy, so it's already in the planning authority policy, so in the Cotswolds, in Cheltenham, in Surrey, in Stroud, and so on. We're still waiting for the government to enact it, so for the secondary legislation to come through and make sure that all developers from November 2023 have this gain of nature on their sites, or purchase of biodiversity net gain units off-site. But we're already seeing this beginning of a biodiversity market. So I'll go back to the beginning and explain what the biodiversity net gain is. So it's an approach to development or land management that aims to leave the natural environment in a measurably better state than it was before. So previously we've had net loss, where developers have been able to develop where they want and not replace nature. We've moved to no net loss, which is kind of where we are at the moment. We're moving into net gain, where they have to replace and enhance the nature that we're seeing lost. I get this question a lot. So what is an actual unit of biodiversity? How on earth are they actually measuring it? So it's focused on habitat at the moment. So a biodiversity unit is about a measure of habitat, and that unit is measured on its distinctiveness, which is its rarity in England, times its importance to wildlife, its condition, and linked to location. So as an example of that, floodplain meadow is a very rare, pretty rare habitat in England, and it's important to wildlife because of its certain hydrology and species richness. If it's in very good condition and it's in an ecologically strategic site, we might have a very high biodiversity unit rating, say maybe 9 units per hectare. Biodiversity units also measured on its basis is in expert opinion and the ecological literature, and there's basically a calculator, a DEFRA biodiversity metric, which is now version 3.1, which is used to measure this and used by accredited ecologists. So the number of biodiversity net gain units you can achieve depends on your current habitat baseline and what that can be converted to. So you're looking at, if you've got a basic habitat baseline, can you change it to a more distinctive habitat type, or can you improve your habitat's condition? So for example, if you've got poor, unproductive cropland, are you able to change that to a species-rich grassland? Or if you have an orchard that's in disrepair and poor condition, can you move that to a high or better condition? And then you're moving from your low baseline, saying maybe you've got 3 biodiversity units as a baseline per hectare, moving that to maybe 6 biodiversity units per hectare, giving you an increase of 3 biodiversity units per hectare. So just looking at it from the developer side for a minute, because this is how it affects them and where the advantage is for landowners. So each developer, where they're developing on a site of more than 0.5 hectares or 9 residential dwellings, will be required to add nature to the site, to 10% in Gloucestershire, 20% in other places, and we might move towards that 20% mark in time. An ecologist will come and do the assessment on the developer's site using the DEFRA biodiversity metric and establish how many units they need to add to their site. The local planning authority will approve the developer's net gain plan, and any habitat, any new biodiversity units must be secured for at least 30 years, whether that's on-site or whether it's through a purchase of biodiversity net gain units off-site. And this will be nationally registered, and it doesn't impact any of the existing current environmental protections. So you'll all be interested probably in the BNG unit market rate. So biodiversity net gain units are currently trading and are likely to trade here at around £22,000 to £25,000 per unit. And I'm sort of work on an average of 2 to 3 biodiversity net gain units per hectare. But if you're considering this for your land, what you need to think about is, once you've got you understand your baseline, how many biodiversity units you currently have on your land and how many you might be able to move to, is that payment per unit going to be enough to cover your initial investment costs and you for the next 30 years. So it's a one-off payment, we'll come to that a bit later, but basically you're selling your biodiversity net gain uplift once, and you get this payment in which has to cover the 30-year agreement. And all biodiversity net gain agreements are for this 30 years. That's what's been enshrined in the Environment Act. So, for example, your cost, this price that you set, will need to cover getting your land BNG investment ready, so your surveys, soil tests, your habitat management plan, and any contract preparation. It will have to cover the actual habitat creation and habitat management from 0 to 30 years. You'll also have to consider any reductions in tax, which Nicholas will talk a bit about later, and consider potential inflation. We also will be charging a broker fee of around 15 to 18%, and that will cover the business running costs, the monitoring and compliance costs, which we'll have to factor in over the course of 30 years and reporting back to DEFRA on it. So there's some land that we know currently is ineligible for BNG agreements or schemes, and some which is compatible with BNG schemes. So what we know at the moment, and this is all potentially subject to change because the secondary legislation isn't out yet, but what we know at the moment is that statutory designated sites such as SSIs and SACs aren't eligible or compatible with BNG. Sites for carbon credits aren't at the moment, and land already under countryside stewardship agreement. So carbon credits are interesting, as Jenny said, because you, on your site, say you've got 10 hectares, you could have 5 hectares and create a woodland on that and reserve that for carbon credits, which you might want to use to offset the carbon emissions of your own business. And the remaining 5 hectares you could use to enter into a BNG scheme. It might also, I think it's also worth thinking about and maybe having the the surveys and audits, which we can talk about individually, for making sure your site is carbon code verified, so that in 20, 30 years' time, when your land, your new woodland is actually starting really to sequester carbon, to be able to have that to potentially sell on to the carbon credit market once it's better established and there's a better payment rate for it. Things that are compatible with BNG are solar schemes, suitable alternative natural green space, which probably more affects the council-owned land, and non-statutory wildlife sites, which are key local wildlife sites. With biodiversity net gain schemes, you might also hear mentioned local nature recovery strategies, LNRSs. So this is also within the Environment Act. It's a new mandatory system of spatial strategies for nature. The intention is that these sort of maps of nature recovery will target better investment in nature. And it's a weighting factor or a multiplier within the biodiversity metric calculator itself. All these are meant to be coming out next year, or the guidance was meant to be out this year. It's not out yet, so Gloucestershire hasn't been able to create its LNRS yet. But what we have, as Jenny already mentioned, as a proxy for the moment, which we're working with, is a nature recovery network created by GSA and Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust. So that's what we're using to kind of steer our strategic placement of nature across Gloucestershire as a guide. So happy to take questions on all of that at the end of this and at the very end. But I'll just move on to what the Gloucestershire Nature and Climate Fund is. So it's a not-for-profit, and it's just based in Gloucestershire for Gloucestershire, with the intention of restoring nature here and securing better income for landowners who will act as stewards of nature for the next 30 years and more. It was created by the Gloucestershire Local Nature Partnership, so there is an umbrella body of 30 plus nature organisations across Gloucestershire working together under this partnership, and is currently hosted by the G1st Local Enterprise Partnership. So there are lots of BNG brokers, traders, providers springing up across the country. There are some nationally, but we are a not-for-profit, which means that we are focused on nature restoration. Any broker fees that we take will be minimal in order to support the running of the business, the monitoring and compliance side, and making sure that we're doing this in a really strategic way, and making sure that the majority of the funds go to the landowners who are actually going to be creating and maintaining this new habitat. Because the planning authorities are part of the Local Nature Partnership and support the creation of GNCF, we have a really good relationship with them. They have at the moment a memorandum of understanding setting out the ways of working between GNCF and the planning authorities, sort of setting out that GNCF is their trusted provider of biodiversity net gain schemes. So you can be sure that it will go through if you sign up to a BNG scheme. We'll make sure that you have all those steps in place. And crucially, we're not about creating islands or pockets of habitat. It's about looking across Gloucestershire and making sure that we're doing this in the best way for nature and people. You might not be able to see this at the back, but I'll run through it. So this is about entering into a BNG scheme with GNCF. So if you were, I've got a detailed sort of sheet about this. It's a bit more involved. This is a simplification for the slide. But what we need is an expression of interest, just showing that you meet the basic baseline criteria for entering into a biodiversity net gain scheme. GNCF will then go through a prioritisation process, which is about looking at the land, the site of the land in relation to that nature recovery network, seeing where it fits, It's about looking at the priorities of the planning authorities, what their aims are for that area, and for general other things to do with the strategic restoration of nature and what's going on that site at the moment. There'll be a site visit, and this is sort of a more iterative process, because there'll also be a small project board for each district saying, yes, we can put that one through. And then once we've gone through the prioritisation process and the site visit, there'll be a memorandum of understanding to sign between GNCF and the landowner to make sure that everyone's happy and understands how this will work going forward, and so that the landowner has certainty that GNCF will be taking any BNG units to market, and they won't unnecessarily be committing spend without having that certainty. So once the MOU is signed, you can get your biodiversity net gain surveys ready with one of our suppliers. So we use GWT's Wild Service, and their ecologists there. We're working with them to make sure we've got a really solid process in place. You have your habitat creation and costing plan, which you can either choose to do yourself, or with us, or with GWT, or with someone else. And then entering into a conservation covenant, or a section 39, one of these agreements that ensures that any BNG units that you are selling from your land will be secured for 30 plus years. So key things, the land is always going to be under your ownership and management with this scheme. If you're not selling any land, you're selling the uplift they get and guaranteeing that there will be an uplift in biodiversity net gain. GNCF doesn't want you to spend any money until we're guaranteed that we will take you through this process and agree to sell your BNG units. We've got trusted suppliers that we work with, such as Hazlewoods and hopefully Lodders in the future. James Reckley is here. And you, as a landowner, will be deciding and setting your BNG unit price that you're willing to set at, probably within those bounds, but once you've worked out what works for your land and your costs. So expression of interest. I'll send round one of these templates, hopefully by Joe, at the end as a sort of wrap up. But this is the initial expression of interest, which we'd love to have by the end of January, showing you've got landowner permission, a minimum of 7 hectares to enter into the scheme because it's quite involved. You might choose later on to enter some hectares now, some hectares later. Hopefully in the contract we'll be able to leave that a bit open. But you've got that you believe you have significant potential for improvement in existing habitat, that you're committed to the development of the project because this is something you'll have to look at for the next 30 years and you have to be really comfortable with it. Perhaps previous experience of habitat creation or willingness to engage with other experts, and we'll do that check, that initial check against the guideline of the Nature Recovery Network. So as Jenny said, if you search for the Gloucestershire Local Nature Partnership and then look on the mapping tab, you'll get this the Nature Recovery Network up. So you can have a look just as a guideline to see whether your land fits within it. So the yellow marks core existing habitat. The pink, potential for species-rich grassland or grassland habitats or lowland heath. If there's green around it, it'd be woodland. Wetlands are not present on here, but it comes out as a separate blue layer. And orchards are a bright yellow with a red outline. You can click on all of these on the computer screen to bring up these different layers and look at your area in relation to these different mapping layers. And it's to do with expanding the existing networks that exist across Gloucestershire. So taking good habitats, making it bigger. So the ideal sites are perhaps next to triple SIs or SACs or nature reserves, but that's not exclusionary. Like if you have a great site to work on and it doesn't exactly fit, don't worry, that's probably something we can work with. Just what it looks like with all the layers up. You want to zoom in, it's a bit overwhelming. I think we got through that. So just on the other side then, so once we've been through that process, GNCF markets your units to the developers who are working in Gloucestershire. Then they express interest in and tell us, what sites they're working on, how many units they need. We do our due diligence on them, making sure they've got their net gain plans sorted, and then they do a declaration of intent to purchase, and we issue a certificate for the NG units, at which point planning condition is discharged by the planning authority, and they make the payment, which GNCF then manages out to you. So we know that planning can take time. So this is not a quick process by any stretch. So we look at a 30-year agreement, and planning conditions can take a number of years to come through. There's also the issue that developers might just want 20 units here, another developer wants another 10 units. So there's something to think about if you're going through this process. I'm sure Andrew will talk about this maybe. If you want to start at the habitat creation across one field, if you've only sold the units from half of it. So there is some kind of risk management and business decisions to make along those lines. So if Andrew's going to talk now about his experience from the landowner point of view, and if by the end of that you still feel that a biodiversity net gain scheme is right for you in your land, I'd love to have an expression of interest from you. And there's more information.
Good morning, everyone. Hopefully my non-dulcet tones will carry to the back, but if not, wave your hands and I'll go to the microphone. My name's Andrew Bower. I love a captive audience, so my commiserations to you all. I'm here with two hats this morning. One being a farmer. We have two small diversified farms, one near Newent in Gloucestershire and the other in the Wye Valley in South Herefordshire. Both of those are up for BNG. Gloucestershire are, I'm pleased to say, far more advanced than Herefordshire, who are concentrating on their nutrient neutrality at the moment and are risking being a long way behind the curve. So, as is quite often the case with this, you've got different authorities throughout the country doing things at different speeds and in completely different ways as well. So it does make it quite confusing. I also am a land agent for my sins, and my business, Court Consulting, we specialise in medium and large-scale residential and mixed-use development schemes, which is how this came onto my radar a few years ago, because obviously it forms a very important part of all sorts of new substantive developments that are happening from November next year. So local authorities really haven't got very long to get their act fully on stream, or they won't be actually able to grant planning consent. So it's going to be quite an important issue for them. Right. So in terms of my farms, what we've done so far is have a baseline survey undertaken by an ecologist to see what we've got and what the potential would be. And after you've had that baseline survey, you're able to look and consider what types of activity can happen without major changes. So, for example, you might have areas of pasture that have got potential to be brought up to species-rich standard, or you may have arable land that you're happy to put into grassland, and you can choose the mix that suits you and your interests and your grazing regimes. But you also need to think about some of the other things that will work in terms of points, and you need to be commercial about this. So, for example, one thing that gives you lots of points and obviously more money is creating scrubland. Now, for a lot of landowners, that may be a step too far. So you need to think what works for you. Creating woodland may be more palatable than scrub. So it's a really important part of the process. to think about where your interests are and what floats your boat, because you're going to be looking at this for a long time. Once you've calculated the credits, you can start playing with the figures and seeing how that fits into your business operation. And we are now at a stage on the Gloucestershire farm of waiting for these conservation covenants to be published. And once we've seen that, then we can work out the correct technical mechanisms for implementing that. But the important parts of it, from a landowner point of view, are the initial capital works, the establishment and creation of that habitat, how that will be taken. And once you've got that schedule agreed, there will be a separate maintenance guide, very much akin to what many of us in here will be used to from mid-tier or HLS type agreements. And I think it's very, very useful to just have a fairly straightforward Bible that you can pick up and go, I'm not sure what date I'm allowed to top this land, what fertiliser I'm going to put on there, and that will all be in a set pack that you will have agreed as part of your agreement. So we're not trying to reinvent the wheel with this whole process. We're using a lot of the existing terminology that many of us will already be familiar with. Once we've got that established, as you've seen from Rachel's talk, those credits will be sold, and there'll be input from your accountants and your solicitors to get that bound up, and you will be on the hook for it. You need to realise this. This is not going to be something where you can get a nice big cheque, do a little bit of nominal work, and then evaporate off to live in Barbados for the next 20 years on the back of it. There are going to be quite onerous obligations and maintenance requirements on that, and the need for self-reporting, and then there will obviously be inspections by GNCF as well. So the money comes in up front at the early stages of it, but you need to account for how that's going to be sitting within your business and pay for those works, and that reduction in output from habitat creation that will follow. Bear in mind, tax, Nicholas is obviously going to dwell on that much more detail, but you need to make sure you've got the right structures going into it as well. And once you have got the payment and the certificates have been issued, there's going to be a 12-month period to create that habitat. So it doesn't matter if you sign it all up in June and you're sitting there going, I don't want to try and create grass now, I know it's all going to die. There will be a period so that the right window, weather permitting, will be there for that creation. Rachel's already touched on this, but I think it's important to realise the scale that potentially is out there for demand for BNG units. All infrastructure projects are going to need it, so things like HS2 or road widening schemes, new motorway junctions, all of those are going to need credits. Some organisations like Network Rail have got a lot of their own land where they can provide it, but others will need to outsource that. For those of you who have got development on your own land, you should have scope to provide that on site. And I think if you are entering into new promotion, option agreements, conditional contracts, whatever it may be, you do need to make sure that your advisors are thinking about how BNG is going to be accounted for, because there is a value to it. Without wishing to go too much down a technical sideline, you need to think whether you might be able to persuade developers to include it within your net developable area. That's unlikely, but it shouldn't just be something that's put in as an additional bit of land that's just needed. There is a definite value to this. So, as you're all familiar with, there are a plethora of us out there who are very happy to come and take your money to give you advice. You need to decide who the right people are to listen to, but I would start at home, because with a 30-year commitment, it's a big step change from 5 or 10 years under a mid-tier or similar agreement. And for many of us, it's going to be the next generation that are going to be carrying on working the land under the constraints that we are imposing through a BNG agreement. Once you've had that potentially interesting conversation at home, you need to start off with finding the right ecologist for this. I've had 2 different ecologists, one doing the Herefordshire farm. They're a big national consultancy. They've done a lot of work on BNG projects elsewhere, but I felt it was very much more of going through the rubber stamp process, and there wasn't that much scope for me to get as much input and steer them if I hadn't, taken a pretty strict line with them. So for my Gloucestershire project, it worked much better. There was a lot more interaction. What's of interest to me? What are the areas that are going to deliver more straightforward points? Do I feel I can deliver what's classed as a moderate level of habitat or a good level of habitat, because there are different points for each of those, and sometimes there's not that much of a gap between them. So do you want to step up and say, I'm sure I can deliver a gold-plated, really top-quality flower meadow or wetland, if you're only going to get 5%, 10% more points for that sort of fairly onerous condition. But equally, if there are a lot more points for it and you're pretty confident that you can deliver that landscape, then it's worth going for a good condition one. As farmers, we're not generally very good at thinking about what our customers want, but I wanted to put in speaking with GNCF and also speaking with the developer or the other purchaser of those B&G units to make sure that there is that alignment. Now, a lot of that will be possible through Rachel and her growing team, but there's no point in having a large amount of a certain type of habitat available if that doesn't tie in with what some of the developer needs are going to be. I would say this, but I think there's for most landowners there'll be a need to get some land agency advice about seeing how it fits in within your holding. You need to be aware that there will potentially be an impact on land values, which are likely to go down because of the reduction in this your financial output from the land. And that potentially could have an impact on how much you can borrow against it, for example, or if there was a possibility that the land might be sold. And I think they are probably the right people also to be speaking with about, are you going to do this work, or are you going to outsource it to either to a contractor or to one of the many organisations that are out there looking at taking on the whole obligation for it. I make no secret of the fact that I have grave concerns about going down that route, because they are taking a big slice of the pie, and I will talk about that a little bit more later in this presentation. Again, early doors accountancy advice is important, because you want to make sure that the funds for this and the obligations for this are sitting within the right vehicle. I would suggest that if you are in your late 80s, getting a large capital lump sum coming in potentially could have a nasty tax implication should you get run over by a bus. And there will be a need for legal input in the process, because these are quite complicated agreements. For those of you who had experience of development, very similar to a Section 106, so there are very important protections that you need to make sure are put in place, and that you fully understand what you're signing up to, and that will be a combination of agent, solicitor and accountancy advice. So what scale? There are big sums of money potentially available here, and that can look like something to rush towards, but you need to consider what's right for your particular bit of land. Is it something that suits an offlying field or two that are some way away from the main business, your poorer quality land, or is it something that you'd like to address as a whole farm scale? I've got clients of mine who has said this is something that really is of huge interest to them, and they're very happy given that they're already under a contracting arrangement, so they don't have those high fixed costs of machinery to worry about transitioning the whole of their farm, if that is available, into a B&G scheme. As I said earlier, succession is important, so will you be thanked for what you've done? Take some strong consideration of if the whole farm is suddenly going to become a butterfly meadow or a wetland, and your son or daughter is mustard keen on being a dairy farmer, there might be a little bit of a conflict there. And the really exciting bit for me is, what habitats do you enjoy? Because there's a great possibility here to really go down and create some wonderful habitat that's fantastic for you and your family and for the wider environment. And think about how that can potentially be managed as well. Wildflowers and meadows obviously have constraints on when they can be grazed. You may find that having a very intensive commercial breed of cattle won't sit very well on a delicate meadow where more traditional rare breed type livestock will graze it far better. But equally, creating woodland might be your passion. So there are lots of different opportunities there. You're going to be responsible for looking after it, so you might as well do something that you think is of interest, but also fits within your economic parameters. And as I said earlier, think about what the end user wants as well, because if you can't sell those credits in the marketplace, it's not a very useful spend of your money. There are risks, and the whole of this, like any business decision, is risk and reward, and your appetite for that risk, whether you want to be one of the early people in the market, or whether you'd rather wait a little bit, see how the market evolves, because this isn't something that's going to disappear. It had fairly broad cross-party support, so at the moment we're not seeing any inkling of changes to government policy, but it could happen. We've all seen dramatic changes. So you might say, well, actually, I'd rather get in early on it. The level of demand isn't yet known, and obviously that's going to be affected by general economic factors, the strength of the property market. If less houses are built, if less new developments are started, there's going to be less need for B&G during those periods of time. But property markets are cyclical, so there'll be lean years and there'll be very, very busy years when developers will be scurrying around. And there's likely to be some sort of changes in market prices being paid over that period for B&G units. Cash flow as a farmer is normally pretty lousy anyway, so you're used to it. But you will be needing to spend some of that money up front in terms of commissioning the surveys, investing time with your advisors, and then having those credits at a marketable stage before they start selling. And bear in mind that you might have 500 points or credits available to sell, but they're not all going to sell in the first few months. They will be sold as the market requires them. You also must think about the risk, because at the end of the day, the money needs to reach you, and you need to consider the risk profile of who you're contracting with to make sure you're confident that that's going to arrive back with you. Now, GNCF are backed by the local authority, and as you heard, they're a not-for-profit organisation, so to my mind, that made it a lot more sensible to enter into an agreement with them. And you do need to make sure your solicitors are comfortable with the structure of the deal and where that money is going to sit after you start the works. If it's not all paid up on day one, and it is likely that an initial payment will cover the setup costs and the likely tax payments that you'll need to make. And I don't want to steal Nicholas's thunder, but it's likely tax will be payable right at the beginning of the process. You need to make sure you know where that money is sitting. Is it sitting in a solicitor's escrow account or an independent provider's escrow account, or is it sitting in GNCF's account? You want to be very, very clear about where that is. And again, harking back to my rant earlier about the risk of third-party providers, if one of those goes bust, there is a fallback commitment on your land, because these will normally be secured by a registered local land charge. So it's something that will be on the land registry deeds showing that you have entered into this commitment. So that obligation cannot be wriggled out of. And there will be an evolving mechanism for seeking the correct remedy. Now, at first, that's likely to be a soft touch with a notice served by GNCF saying your obligations are X. We did an audit. Only 30% of the trees that you've planted have survived the first 2 years. Where is your commitment and plan for replanting those? So you need to be aware that some of those costs, may come and haunt you if someone has taken all of that risk but then disappeared over the horizon. You, as the landowner, will be left holding that particular package of repair measures that need to be taken. Carrying on with that theme, you'll see lots of adverts in Farmers Weekly and CLA magazine and all those sorts of publications with outfits looking to take the paperwork and stress away from you and de-risking it. Yes, that there is an element of de-risking, but I would suggest that there is not a huge risk to landowners in entering into this directly, because you will have control over the process. These are not strange new processes that none of you have heard of before. This is something that's been happening over the past 15, 20 years through stewardship schemes and things like that. So it's quite a known quantum for all of us, and I think it's quite an easy process to control yourself, and it's a good business opportunity for you and future generations to deal with the maintenance of the habitat that you're creating. This last bit is, it's up to you really. I can't tell you whether you should be going for it now or later. You need to think about how it fits in with the timings. Are you about to install a new dairy parlour? Are you about to buy a new combine? If you are, then you want to think about the timings of how this would fit in on that. Are you going to need to borrow the funds to get the service and get the advice on that? In which case there's a higher risk involved for you. And as I said earlier, you're not going to get all of that money.
Good morning everyone. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Smail. I'm a partner in the Farms and Estates team at Hazlewoods. We're accountants based in Cheltenham. I specialise in tax, and we're a team of about 30 people, 35 people, who are looking after landowners and farmers, doing their accounts and all their tax needs. We're increasingly sort of seeing this come up as a topic of conversation. As you'll all know, basic payment scheme is being withdrawn. So obviously that's going to leave quite a big hole in a lot of people's accounts, and so people are sort of turning to alternative streams of funding to see how they can replace that, and this is obviously one of them. So what I'm going to take you through today, a bit of a run through inheritance tax, to sort of discuss which habitats are being created, is it actually active farming, then look at capital or revenue, so that's whether it's income, timing and treatment of the receipts, VAT, bit on woodland, and then possibly a bit on carbon credits at the end. So you might wonder, just before I say that, there's been a lot today about how it's all very uncertain. I'm afraid that's equally true for tax. I'm on the CLA tax committee. It's something we spent a lot of time discussing, but HMRC have produced absolutely no guidance. So basically where we're going is based on tax law and what we know to date. We hope that, given that it's something the government are pushing, that they will come up with some tax-friendly policies on this and not look to penalise landowners, but obviously there's no guarantee. The other thing is, Andrew has pointed out in his talk, there's lots of different ways of doing this. So, you know, I'm going to talk generally and sort of in my discussions with Rachel and GNCF, but depending on, if you do decide to go forward, depending on how you enter into it, you do need to sort of look at your circumstances specifically, because what I say today may not apply to you depending on how you do it. So you might wonder why I'm starting with inheritance tax. And I suppose, you know, Andrew's talked about this being for 30 years, and we've talked about having baseline surveys of your farm from an ecological point of view. And I think inheritance tax is kind of like a baseline survey for tax purposes. Because as farmers, many of you at the moment will qualify for reliefs. So we've got agricultural property relief, which effectively relieves the value of agricultural land from inheritance tax at the agricultural value. It can also give relief to the farmhouse. For those diversified businesses, we've got business property relief. So provided we've got a business that is wholly or mainly trading, then the market value of that business can get 100% relief from inheritance tax. So when I say wholly or mainly trading, what we're looking at is the capital value of the assets used in the business, splitting them between trading activities, which is typically your farming, and investment activities, which is probably typically your let properties. So we're looking at capital employed, turnover, profit, time employed, and then we have to stand back and look at the business in the round. And talk about Balfour, that was a case that some of you may be familiar with a few years ago now. So that's kind of quite often known as Balfour planning. But it's sort of understanding your position of where we are today. Because if you go into some of these schemes, depending on what you're doing, it could change your position. So if you don't know where your starting point is, you then enter into a BNG scheme, you could end up in a worse position and not be aware of it. If having done, you do your baseline survey, hopefully you will qualify for full relief from inheritance tax. We can then model what will happen if you go into the scheme. And again, it may or may not make a difference. Andrew's talked about putting a few hectares in to the whole farm. Well, probably if you're going to put the whole farm in, that's going to have a very different outcome to if you're just doing a few hectares. So having done that, it may or may not have adverse consequences, but at least then you can take an informed decision that you're going to go ahead anyway. You might decide you don't want to do it, or alternatively, it might be a question of we do want to do it, but do I want to retain ownership of the land, or should I be thinking about passing it on maybe to the next generation, the use of a trust or something like that. Then coupled with that, if you're going to do that, you've got to think about, okay, so if I pass it on, I'm probably not going to get the income or the payments that are going to be received for BNG. So if I pass the land on, they're going to go with it. So there are multiple things to think about here. The other thing is, these are 30-year agreements. So obviously I'm talking about the rules today, particularly for inheritance tax. That will only come into being at the point when someone dies. So that could be quite a long way through the arrangement. So just because the rules are what they are today, we don't know that they will be the same in the future. And as Andrew mentioned as well, once you've signed up, it may change the value of your land. And I've spoken to a few agents, and there sort of seem to be differing views and uncertainties about actually how will you value the land once it's subject to an agreement for 30 years. So in terms of thinking about what the impact might be, it's sort of understanding what habitat we're going to be creating. So we've heard a bit about species-rich grassland, wetlands, woodland, and we mentioned scrub. We've also got orchards. So these are all potentially quite varied, and the impact of all of these might be quite different when we're looking at our farming our business from an inheritance tax perspective. So the things that we're kind of going to be looking at to consider the position is have we still got agricultural husbandry? Is there a trade happening? So if we look at species-rich grassland, then my understanding is, you will still be able to graze it. You can probably take a crop of hay off it, but you're probably less intensive on the inputs. So that feels like it's probably still farming. If we're doing wetlands, it may be slightly different. Now, if you're creating, say, a pond area and lots of sort of, I say scrub, but wild ground around it that's not disturbed, not grazed, then potentially there you're no longer farming. Likewise, if you go to woodland, then there's specific rules on the taxation of that, and I'll come on to that later. Scrub, again, probably difficult to argue you're farming if the land's just gone wild, depending on whether you have to graze it at all. So this, that will impact, going back to our sort of Balfour matrix, is it trading, is it not? Depending on the activity that's being undertaken, that will impact where it all sits and whether you can, is it still trading activity? Can you qualify for APR? If you reduce the land for a farmhouse, it's got to be character appropriate to the land it's being farmed with. So if we're losing land that it's being farmed with, do we risk APR on our farmhouse? So there's lots of bits to think about. Also from a trading perspective for farmers, you've got farmers averaging, so the potential, if you have good and bad years, to average profits over up to 5 years, the ability to offset losses, and and as I said, the IHT relief. So there's lots of different bits to think about before you make the decision to go ahead. So assuming that you have decided to go ahead, then you're going to receive this payment. We've been talking about figures of £20,000 to £25,000 a unit. How are we going to treat that payment? So typically in tax we've got two things. Either it's capital when we're looking at capital gains tax, or it's income. Here we've gone back. There's a case from 1922, Glenboy Union Fire Clay. This involved a company that was trying to effectively mine clay, part of which was under a railway line, and the railway company weren't very happy with this, so they paid them not to do it. And it was a question for that company, the clay people, was that money income or capital? And the judge in that case is the sum of profit which is paid to an owner of property on the terms that he shall not use his property so as to make a profit. So here we're saying the payment is in relation to a capital asset, and you're entering into this covenant, so arguably it is not income, which for a lot of people would probably be more favourable than having it as income. If the payment is for a loss of income, then HMRC would see that as income, and so you would have to treat it for tax purposes as income. So, having looked at our payments and decided what it might be, if it's capital, so we're into capital gains tax, typical rates are 10% for basic rate taxpayers, but more typically it will be 20%, particularly given the level of the sums involved. We can also obviously set off the capital gains tax annual exemption, although following the budget for the autumn statement, I should say, last week, within a couple of years that will be pretty much gone. There is also the possibility of rollover relief. So if you're looking to go and purchase more land, then providing you do so either 1 year before or 3 years after the receipt, then you'd be able to roll over that gain into the new land. If you're struggling to find it, HMRC can by discretion extend those limits. The alternative is obviously income. Now we've talked about these agreements being for 30 years. So if you're being paid, and particularly on the management side, and I think this is where the split is possibly going to be, and we're going to have an initial payment for entering into the agreement, which is signing up for the covenant. So in effect, by signing that agreement, you are making a restriction on the use of your land for 30 years. So I think there we can argue that that is most likely capital. However, the payments for the ongoing management feel much more payments for a service, and so they will more likely be treated as income. Because they're in over 30 years, even though you're receiving it up front, under normal accounting principles, we should be able to spread the taxation of that payment over the 30-year period and recognise it equally. Of course, we will then be able to offset the costs of managing the land. And then income tax rates are obviously sort of 20, 40, 45%. I think the other important bit about recognising some of it as income is going back to our inheritance tax position, where what we're looking at is part of the test is turnover and profit. Is by having some income in there, we can demonstrate that we are still the land is still a business asset, and if we can show it's farming, we're actually doing to trading, we're doing something for it, then that would put it on the trading side of our line. VAT, as always, rears its ugly head. I'm not a VAT specialist, but we do have some within the firm. So again, going back, having been talking about part of it being treated as capital, I think if we're entering an agreement, a restrictive covenant, then that will be an exempt supply of VAT. In fact, it's related to a supply of land. The only caveat to that will be if anyone has actually opted to tax any of their farm for VAT. Generally that's pretty rare. Then for the payment for the establishment of the habitat and the ongoing management, that would be a supply of services. So in that case, the landowner will have to account for VAT on the payment that they are allocating to those activities. And if you're not already registered for VAT, which I'd have thought would be very unlikely for most farmers, and if that payment takes them over the threshold, then they would need to consider registering. If we're creating woodland, then there are some sort of quite favourable tax rules around woodland at the moment. If we have commercial woodland, and there is no real definition of this, other than woodland that is managed on a commercial basis with the view to the realisation of profits, and generally, we would expect to see that you would have a woodland management plan and you can demonstrate that that is what you're doing. So commercial woodland is outside the scope of tax. So if you sell any timber, there's no tax on the income, but equally you can't get relief for the expenses. Now, if we're starting from scratch, we're probably not going to be doing much in terms of sales in the first 30 years anyway, because it will be establishing the woodland and getting it growing. The other thing, which is a positive, is because it's commercial woodland, it counts as a trading activity when we're looking at our inheritance tax position. So that's a good one to have. If it's smaller pieces of woodland, say amenity woodland, shelter belts and field margins, these sort of within any sales would fall within your farming business. Providing they are kind of ancillary to the farming business, then they will qualify for agricultural property relief. But if there's sort of larger blocks that are not managed commercially, then they would not qualify for agricultural property relief. But there is, from inheritance tax purposes, woodland relief. So that means that the value of the trees is exempt from inheritance tax, but the land itself, underlying land, would be taxable. So again, if you are creating woodland as part of the scheme, we just need to think about how that's going to sit and what the consequences will be. Then the final bit I had was on carbon credits. We've been told that we can't actually have both, but because it's more than, our woodland is likely to be for more than 30 years, they may be there as an opportunity at the end. So there is the Woodland Carbon Code, which is a voluntary standard for creating woodland, and essentially what you have to do is register the woodland creation with it, and then you have what's called pending issuance units, which is effectively the carbon that might be available to be sequestered, and after a period of time, once the trees have grown, then they turn into woodland carbon units, which is actually, well, you can sell both, but if you've got the woodland carbon units, then they're more tangible. So I suspect by the time we've gone through our 30-year period, we're going to be into woodland carbon units rather than the pending issuance units. There's lots of verification and audit processes that have to be gone through to establish what there is there, and you do also have to hold back 20% as a buffer, so in case of disease or windfall or anything like that. Again, there's not really any guidance on the taxation of this, but arguably these carbon units are the output of commercial woodland if it is woodland that is being managed commercially, and so they would be free of tax. The alternative is that HMRC would see them as separate from the trees, and so they would be sort of trading income. There's also a question as to whether you sell your units in sort of 5-year blocks, or you could sell them for the whole life of the woodland. So if you're selling them for the whole life of the woodland, there's more risk potentially for you as a landowner, because if you sell them and then the trees are no longer there, you've got an issue. But if you are selling them in a big block, then potentially you might argue that's a capital gain, because it's a long disposal rather than a short 5-year disposal. So again, there's lots of uncertainties here, but it is something there as another potential source of income. As Andrew said, I'll also be around later. I've also got Shirley, my colleague, is here. So if you'd like to speak to either of us, please do. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to introduce you to Marina from the Sustainable Food Trust, who's going to do a few slides at the end. Just to say, I mean, those are amazing presentations about BNG, but isn't it complicated? And that's just one of those developing mechanisms that we were talking about, and amazing expertise here about that particular strand. I think from my perspective, what we were trying to do with the ELMS Phase 3, and we have to give credit to the Sustainable Food Trust for funding the successful application to DEFRA for our Phase 3 trial. It took over 250 hours of application time that the Sustainable Food Trust paid for a consultant, because I gave up, and I've never given up before, and I gave up, and Tamsin Howard Beck persisted. And this is, the Sustainable Food Trust see this trial as being really important. So Marina's going to do a little bit at the end of just a few slides I'm going to put up. Because I think it's absolutely critically important that we as farmers, land managers, people involved in the farming business get those baselines. And what we had hoped, when I'll put my presentation up again, is that we could do this over the whole county. But unfortunately, they wouldn't let us, DEFRA. We gave up trying to do the whole county because with the technology, and some of you I know have been very involved with it will come in a second, hopefully, yeah. So have been very involved with the developmental work that we've been doing. Hopefully shout if you can't hear me at the back. With the developmental work we've been doing with Ordnance Survey and with all sorts of other partners like the Land App and Centre for Ecology and Hydrology and all sorts of people, that we've now got satellite technology that enables us to be able to do a lot of remote sensing, which is probably how DEFRA will adjudicate a lot of these different mechanisms ultimately, for anything from assessing above ground carbon to below ground carbon, to be looking at, you know, that land use change as it goes forward. So we've got an enormous amount of support for that sort of element of remote sensing, but there's also an enormous amount of opportunity for us to translate existing data that you have in the way that you might have mapped your land from BPS codes or countryside stewardship codes into that UK habitat classification. So what we were anticipating that we would do for our ELMS Phase 3 was to say, we can now do this, let's do the whole county to help create a baseline that's based on farmers' knowledge and real-time, a dynamic agricultural land use, rather than having something that is good but is built from sort of scraped data. So from a point of view, so just to recap on our ELM trial. Right, so in our ELM trial, as I say, what we were doing was we were developing a natural capital methodology that was based around the UK HAB codes, and as I say, what we wanted to do was to demonstrate the effectiveness of an integrated framework. So on your table you have the summary of the Phase 3, which is this little document here, which is talking about how you can sign up to the Global Farm Metrics, which Marina is going to talk about in a minute, and also the opportunity to be a rural facilitator who can actually work out what's going on anywhere in your locality. Sorry, technology finally failed me. Sorry, apologies for that. So basically what we're trying to do with our Phase 3 is we're going to do an environmental assessment on 5 water bodies with the help of all of you farmers, hopefully, to be able to create that environmental baseline. What we want to do is to create a baseline habitat map that you can either use as an opportunity for a baseline for a biodiversity net gain assessment, but what we also want to do is, which Marina is going to talk about if the technology works, is giving you the opportunity to sign up to the Global Farm Metric Assessment, which will enable you to potentially have a sustainability standard linked to your farm that will link to those wider assessments earlier on. So the trial, it seems to have slightly slipped, apologies, but it's in here for you if you want it, is that it's effectively going to create an opportunity for you to have a baseline habitat map, which is Alex Robinson's, which we found was really a brilliant way of being able to assess the land with habitat and habitat codes. And I'm just going to take that down and see if it will make it smaller so you can see it, that's better. And then you can actually sort of start to create that baseline, and it sounds, you know, if you're going to explore opportunities like biodiversity net gain, that will give you a chance to have a look at those assessments. So we're going to start to work at a resolution of every field parcel, hopefully to aggregate. That's why you're sat in groups with maps on your farms, to be able to see on the tables, to be able to see how your farm sits within the landscape, because we've been talking very much about For farm resilience, for climate emergency and for delivering public goods, we want to manage water for the benefit of managed soil and also connecting habitats, as we've been talking about. And that what we want to be able to do is to create a methodology that all farmers across Gloucestershire, so Sarah's here with the Severn Vale and Ellie has farmers in the Forest of Dean, can actually start to create this baseline opportunity that has a landscape scale opportunity for them to look at those different mechanisms. So the technology that we're working on at the moment, Charlie's here, who's our new GIS officer, is that we aim to be able to, if you do the sign up to Global Farm Metric, to be able to tag your sustainability data to your habitat type and your land parcel, for you to make the choices, the multiple choices that you might want to help with and facilitate what's the best advice for those different field parcels, and to be able to keep that data in a place that's sort of suitable for you to be able to share with people that might want to invest in those landscapes. So I'm just going to hand over to Marina because she's going to talk to you about the Global Farm Metric. If you just press that down when you want to know. Thank you. Sorry about that.
Hello everybody, I hope you can hear me all right. So on my way here I had a whole presentation and I thought it was going to be very boring, so I wrote a whole new one for you. And I hope it's all right. I just basically want to tell you about the Global Farm Metric, how it all started and what is it for. We've been hearing about everything we need to do with our farms, anything that we need to manage in our farms, in your farms actually, and there's no way of managing anything without measuring. So the story of the Global Farm Metric, it started a while back with one farmer, Patrick Holden from the Sustainable Food Trust. He's a dairy farmer in Wales, and he was very, very tired of collecting information and giving information away to all these certifiers and schemes and ELMS and all these things that are happening. And he had mainly two problems. The first one was that all these certifiers, all these certifications, they were asking for kind of the same information but in a very slightly different way, and also that this information was not really telling him anything important and relevant about the sustainability of his farm. So during the ELMS phase 1, he met an agri-ecologist from Reading University, Dr. Lawrence Smith, who at that time was already working on a whole farm sustainability assessment based on a common language, aligned with other frameworks, that it was supposed to be practical to use, focus on outcomes, and who could actually be based on scientific evidence and could potentially drive change across the public sector and the private sector. So Lawrence was working on the theory behind all of this, and the theory of measuring the impacts of farm practices. And Patrick, of course, wanted to learn more about the sustainability aspects of his farms to make more informed decisions across environmental, economic, and social indicators. But at this point, the framework was just a framework. It's a nice wheel full of colors, it's beautiful. But it needed to be translated to something practical, something that could be used by farmers.
Sorry, can I just ask, you're competing with people putting lunch on. Would it be alright if you use the microphone?
Absolutely.
Hello?
That's by the way, the coffee is great. So yes, at this point the framework was just a framework, and it needed to be translated to something that farmers could use, something tangible, something that we can actually have a methodology to collect all this information and to measure sustainability on farm. So Patrick gathered a few farmers, some friends, and he shared this new and very important revolutionary concept of the Global Farm Metric and the wheel and the framework. And of course he was very keen on having everybody to adopt this framework, to learn more about sustainability, to manage risk at farm level, and to prepare for policy change, national policy change. And that was how the Global Farm Metric was born. And our goal today is to prove the value of this framework, and for this we created a self-assessment that you can sign up on the QR code. It's based on a research online tool. It's completely free, accessible for everybody, and it's to collect data from the farm across different seasons, all the seasons, hopefully, to analyze it and give useful information to farmers and to connect with other farmers to understand what they need and how we can all drive change across the public and private sector again. So we know that it's great, it's a self-assessment, it's fantastic, but a self-assessment on its own, as a wheel on its own, it doesn't really mean anything and is not useful if we don't test it with real farmers on real businesses that have really important things to say about the whole process. So we are really looking forward to working with you, all of you, and on this and learn more about your businesses and more about you. So thank you very much.
Rachel, this is for you, if that's okay. Could you give us some idea as to how much demand or how much of a bank, if you like, you're looking to build up across each local authority within the county? Because that really gives us an idea as to, you know, whether it's worthwhile putting projects forward in certain locations. And then secondly, if I may say a question, around your costings to get to that, or your what you're doing for that 15 to 18%. So that just a bit more detail around that, please.
Yeah. I thought this might come up, Alex. Thank you. So we've modelled it basically. No one really knows what the size of the market will be. A lot of studies have shown that most development sites will need between 30 to 60% of their biodiversity net gain units to be off-site. We also know that all models are wrong, so we're just going to take sort of a rough idea that we have of a study that was done in Gloucestershire based on their site allocations for development over the next 20 years. So if we model that, we're looking at about 11,500 units required over the next 20 years, over 6 planning authorities, which works out, if we average that at 3 units per hectare, at about 3,800 hectares over 20 years. So maybe 190 hectares per year. But I want to be slightly risk averse in the first couple of years because I don't want people committing spend unnecessarily on their farms. So if I had 100 hectares per planning authority ready for BNG investment for 23-24, I'd be happy with that. And by the time that comes in and secondary legislation's in, we'll have a much better idea of what that market looks like. And as Andrew said, you know, there's peaks and troughs of development. We might be going into a bit more of a trough with the sort of recession. So the idea is to start off fairly slowly and see where we go with that. Is the second part the broker fee? Most brokers, as far as I know, are charging up to 40% or higher. So we've done a business case, a sort of modelling on what we need to sustain a viable business, which will include possibly making some funds and using an insurance buffer, which might be a habitat bank within the county. So if any habitat schemes do fail, then we've got that buffer, a bit similar to the Woodland Carbon Code buffer that exists. So it's business costs, business running costs, a buffer, cost towards monitoring and enforcement and compliance, which is key to making sure that DEFRA see us as a sustainable, viable business. But also potentially in 5 years' time, the aim of GNCF is also to become a natural capital investment funding platform. So if there is money remaining from that broker fee that we pool, it can be then a fund that could be sent out to other landscape nature restoration projects within Gloucestershire to support those. So that will be an eventual sort of long-term aim.
Can I just so I'm completely clear on this? So the broker, so it's purely a brokerage between the landowner and the corporate or whoever, or the developer, if you like, so there's a fee there. And then it's the, if you like, the maintenance checks, if you like, through that 30-year process. But it's none of the other costs of assessing the site before that, or the ecologist cost, solicitor costs, none of those ones into it. Okay,
Yeah,
fine.
that's right.
Yep.
Yeah.
Can you just make sure if you're asking a question, maybe say it loud enough so those at
Sorry.
the back can hear? I'm conscious that they're not able to hear. Was there another question, Tom?
Yeah, I'm a tenant farmer, and I have AHA land and I have long-term FBT, and I have a very good relationship with my landlord, which I must say, because two of the agents are sat to my right. But I'm slightly confused. I mean, to my left is a landowner, and his position seems much clearer. So we're moving from a point where BPS belonged to me to be replaced by income possibly from carbon trading or biodiversity net gain. And that seems very unclear. In the whole of that presentation on biodiversity net gain, landowning was only mentioned. So I can understand how if you only have a 5 or 10 year FBT, you're automatically excluded from that. But what is the position of tenanted farms, and is it solely down to negotiation with landlords?
Yeah, I'm afraid so. So this is a bit out of our hands because might put James on the spot in a minute. But it's a conservation covenant that we hope to use, and the conservation covenant is described in the Environment Act, and that has to be between the responsible body forming the covenant and the landowner, because it's a 30-year agreement. So if you're a tenant farmer and you get the landowner's agreement, that's to sign up to the conservation covenant, and it has to be between the landowner and the responsible body, whether that's GNCF or the planning authority. That's the way we're told at the moment we have to do it. So we might have to focus just on that for the next couple of years until maybe there's an opening or more flexibility, or things become different. I don't know, James, if you...
Just one quick one to add to that. So if that agreement was forthcoming, and I'm about to come out of an HLS and go into building a mid-tier stewardship, how would I make any evaluation as to, because you mentioned that land in stewardship was not eligible, whether to leave land out because the opportunities in biodiversity net gain were greater? How would I come to that assessment?
Yeah.
Do you want to take that, anyone?
Oh, yeah. Well, the answer is you've got to take a punt on it. I've not renewed my HLS ground in Herefordshire with a view to going into BNG on that land, and I've been out of the scheme for 3 years with no income from that, because I thought that this sort of scenario was quite likely, that there wasn't going to be the ability to sort of stack different schemes on the land. So I'm afraid with that, and going back to your earlier question, it's a point that you're going to have to come to an agreement with your landlord by negotiation, unfortunately, that it's not been very well orientated towards the tenanted sector, partly because of the long-term nature of it, I'm afraid.
Nicholas, do you have a comment? Any more questions? Yes? Tanya?
Thank you. Well, my main question was going to be, thank you, Tom, you mentioned about the tenanted sector, but just changing the subject slightly, you mentioned this scheme, global, whatever it is, forgotten that already.
Global farm metric.
Right. So just as me as a farmer, I'm sat here thinking, oh my goodness, there's all the schemes we have to do the baselines for. I worked closely with Joe on our stewardship application. Now there's something else. So it's wonderful. I'm sure it's all wonderful, all this stuff. But is there an actual benefit to it?
Absolutely. I'll let Marina answer, but I might say something up as well, if that's okay.
Yes, so the benefit is that hopefully there will be no more other assessments that you have to do. This is the main one, and it collects all the information that can fit into all those other assessments in a holistic way as well. It's not just taking on biodiversity or soil or water, it's taking the whole whole farm assessment and sustainability. And yes, also is part of you helping us to move this forward and to go into changing policy and using it in that way as well.
Just make a point. Yeah, and Tanya, I think the thing is that from our perspective is that if you look at all of the trajectory that's happening around tightening environmental legislation and agendas, and the trading of products, and scope 3 carbon emissions, and all the stuff that's happening around products that you sell, that you will need to be able to demonstrate in the future, you know, that your business is trading in a sustainable way. It's coming on board quite quickly, and as I say, that's happening both at that global level, but also our local authorities. You know, once the Environment Act is really enacted in the way that and fed through to the local authorities, you know, if you want to sell your products and services from those landscapes, there will have to be a sustainability standard. And what we're hoping is that will enable a co-investment from lots of different areas, what we're talking about today, but will also enable sort of local authorities and other organisations to buy products from that show the whole ecosystem function of positive landscapes. So it's a complex jargon, but it's really relevant to do, because as farm businesses and all businesses, we will need sustainability standards, particularly around carbon and nature, being carbon nature neutral or negative. So that's the aim of the metric.
Okay, can I just ask then, who will own this data?
You will.
You. Okay, so you won't be able to.
No. No. You will own the data. So it's your data to share with who you want to. So and that's the aim is to explore. And I think for the Sustainable Food Trust position, I would suggest is that they're still in a developmental phase around, you know, what is useful to collect in what format, so that when instead of having lots of different people asking you for your audits, for your, you know, whatever it is, you know, PFLA or your organic certification or whatever it is that people want, that you've got all that data and you can just share it with people how you choose. So that's the plan. Any other questions? Oh, Michael.
It's obviously it's a global problem that we're trying to resolve at national level, which is absolutely the right thing to do. But given that it's a 30-year commitment which would affect what will be set down on the title, are there any indications of what fail-safes there might be in there, or, you know, if there was a national change of focus, which, let's be honest, often there is quite quickly, week to week. But if things change in 10 years' time and the national government is saying we need to focus on something else like food production or a change in tactic, are there any indications of how we could get out of these agreements if we bind ourselves now to a 30-year?
Okay.
Or James,
What's the fail-safe? Yes.
would you like to take the microphone?
Shall I take it?
Would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Right. Yes. Hello, everybody. My name's James Spreckley, and I head up the agricultural team at Lodders. I'm sort of come along today partly for my own interest and because it's relevant to our clients, but also as a firm. We've worked with Warwickshire County Council and a landed estate client up that way, trialling BNG and actually putting some of this into practice. So, but it's really interesting to hear everything that everyone's got to say. I think, sorry, coming back to your question, I don't think there's any sort of hard and fast answers. I mean, I think there is a risk question there which layers on top of some of the risks that Andrew so clearly sort of flagged for us all to think about. And I think the other risk that we've certainly discussed with clients is perhaps policy going the other way, that you think you're only signing up to a 30-year, but by the time you get to the end of the 30-year, something has changed, that it has become sort of an established land use that public policy doesn't want you to suddenly plough up or cut down. So, but I don't think I've got an answer for you in terms of the get out. I'm not aware that the agreements that we have done have included a sort of ripcord valve to sort of get out in case of a change of mind. And I could only imagine that that would involve, at the very least, clawback of funds received. So, yes, sorry, I'll not have an answer.
I mean, I'd just add to that and say I think anyone entering into one of these agreements needs to work on the basis that that's going to be a 30-year agreement, whether you like it or not. And quite rightly,
It is on my thing.
quite rightly, if you do want to try and wriggle out of it, work on the basis of writing a very big cheque to get out of it. So I think, you know, work on the cautious side, but, you know, you're signing up, you're taking the money, you're probably going to have to do what you've signed up for.
Any other, Nick?
Yeah, just going back to the units for BNG, is there likely to be any fluctuation from the £22,000 to £25,000? Do you think it, well, obviously with inflation it may go up a bit, but just sort of thinking to the next generation, will there become, or if you struggle to gather the units you need, then presumably that may force a hand to pay more for them. And the other question was, what devaluation on the land, if you are going to go into a 30-year agreement, do you think there will be? I mean, it's a bit of a million-dollar question, but if I was purchasing the land, I wouldn't want it tied up for 25 years, and the man who's had it for 5 has pocketed all the cash.
Me again. So I think you're right. There is going to be an effect on value. What that's going to be, it's supply and demand. There is still very strong evidence now that almost half of all the land transactions that are happening are to institutional non-farming purchasers, and with them having an eye on their requirements for carbon credits and things like that, that could well underwrite the price, and you may not see any drop in land values. Conversely, were I to be doing a valuation on some land, I think I'd be pretty brave to go in at an equivalent to a non-restricted area of land on that. But I don't, as there's no evidence at the moment, no, I don't think it's possible to come with any specific figure. But I'd have guessed, think at least 20% off the value would be a relatively sensible starting point. I don't know if any of the agents here think that's twaddle or it's a bigger figure than that.
I give you an example. You've got a piece of arable ground that you could go and buy. You can have all of the uplift that's been highlighted on that piece of ground, or you could go and buy an existing piece of woodland where you've got none of that potential uplift, or a lot, severely limited. Are those two worth the same amount of money now if you were to go and buy that piece of ground on the open market? And for the most part, existing woodland trades at a lower value to agricultural ground.
So not necessarily for this.
But not for these reasons.
Yeah.
And so there's
So
a huge argument that
it's
it's not baked into the valuation at the moment.
So Lord Bathurst Park over there has gone up in value, is that correct?
Depends who you're talking to.
Well, I'd actually probably argue the other way, in that it's actually probably not as valuable from an uplift perspective, because it's already delivering a lot of that.
Yeah.
Whereas a lot of the land around it, which may be focused on the food production, is probably worth more because you can do more with it now. You need different revenue streams to try and unlock them.
Okay.
So I might just make a point on that, if I may. One of the things that we've been struggling with is how do you reward maintenance of existing good quality habitats? All of these developing markets seem to require additionality, and it is something that we're really trying to crack, particularly with the National Ecosystem Markets Policy group that we're involved with, because it seems to me that there's an opportunity. If you've already got very good high quality habitats that have reached a high level of organic matter in their soils and have carbon locked up and good ecological quality, that they are delivering high quality ecosystem services that have a value to us as society. So we have to look at the other mechanisms then to see how we can reward that, but that's still a challenge. So at the moment, as Alex says, there is much more clarity around the uplift from where you are. But be aware also that there are limitations around degradation. So please don't feel that it's a good idea to go and degrade your land, because particularly around satellite baselines and stuff like that, that there is requirements that come in from global examples from America about how you shouldn't, you won't be eligible for schemes if you degrade your land to go into them. So that is something that DEFRA has been focusing on, but as yet there's more clarity to be required. Any more questions?
Say a little bit on that.
Yes, of course.
So obviously I'm not a land valuer, but I would say as well though, if you're taking on a piece of land, let's say you're buying it after 20 years, if you know that you've got a liability to spend whatever it might be, £500 an acre or whatever for the next 20 years to maintain it, in working out what you're going to offer for that land, you would work out the cost of that to you. And unless you're being given a substantial part of the funds that the landowner has taken, you would discount any value by that amount.
So a lot of the focus has been today on the landowners and the people who will be responsible for doing that. But the other party that you mentioned is developers or people who will be buying those credits. It seems to me that this scheme is mainly for their benefit. it's a good tick box for them and a good way to greenwash whatever projects they're doing. Pretty but is there any obligation on them as another party who buys into this and benefits from the scheme and drives that demand?
Thank you. So the existing environmental regulations around what the developer has to do on their site still exist. So there's still the mitigation hierarchy, so they still have to avoid as much harm to nature as they possibly can on their site. I think one of the outcomes of the BNG scheme is that the developers will actually try to preserve more nature on site and actually maybe actively put more nature back on site, especially linear features like hedgerows, because that would be relatively easy for them to do. And they'll be doing that because it's expensive to engage with off-site purchase of off-site BNG units and a more lengthy process. So I think one of the core intentions of the scheme will, which is increase nature on those development sites, will probably work for those developers who are not wanting to spend that extra money off-site. So I think GNCF will be doing our due diligence, making sure that those surveys that are coming through from the development sites are done well and by accredited ecologists, so that we're not allowing that greenwash to take place. They're not perfect, but...
And I'd probably just add to that, in pure contractual terms, for those people providing off-site BNG units, which is probably what most of us in here will be interested in doing, there will be no privity of contract between the developer and the landowner. The contract will be between you as a farmer and GNCF. The developer pays their money and it gives them the ability to walk away from it, which, you know, it means it's not their problem, but equally I'd suggest people in this room are far better placed to deliver that biodiversity on the ground and to look after the habitat in the long term than a developer whose prime business role is building property. It's not their bag. We look after land and know what we're doing much better than they do, I'd suggest.
Perfect, thank you. Yes, then.
I just wondered if you think GNCF will be able to command a premium for the BNG units that you're selling. I know in the carbon market, the NGOs, for example, are able to command a premium when they're selling carbon to the likes of Brewdog and Coca-Cola because they like the kudos which comes with, you know, interacting with the charitable sector. Clearly, you guys have got quite a nice sort of social enterprise model. Does that come with a premium?
Yet to be explored, but I think that there is, yeah, it's definitely going to be a benefit. So what I want to explore is, you know, making the most of the fact that these are local provenance biodiversity net gain units and it's not for profit and we're doing it in a strategic way. So yes, it would be absolutely working to get you the best price for your BNG units, and there will be this supply and demand issue because there will be other operators. But yeah, I hope that will play
On
out.
the supply and demand side of things, do you think you'll be able to regulate the market value of BNG units by sort of drip feeding units into the market?
We might not have that level of control, and certainly the government viewpoint on it is that it's an open market.
Yeah.
Yeah, so play by those.
Any more questions anywhere? Oh, right at the back, sir.
Hi, yeah, I'm interested about your interpretation of the role of the local planning authorities, because in my experience, both at the county and district level, it's been a bit of a mixed bag. I didn't know whether you felt that they were actually up to the mark and going to be able to execute when this thing goes properly live next year.
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's so, and one of the reasons that GNCF has been set up is to support planning authorities with their limited resources in this new legislation. So as a team, we've been working to bring the planning authorities along with us. So we held, with Gloucestershire Wildlife Trust, we held a workshop for the lead planning authorities, the strategic development managers, the policy planners, to make sure that everyone was on board with the direction of biodiversity net gain and what they needed to do for it. So GNCF is going to be running training schemes in addition to what the Government Planning Advisory Service currently offer to make sure that the training that they get for BNG is right in the context of Gloucestershire and that they're up to speed. And as I mentioned, we've got this memorandum of understanding which outlines how each planning authority works with GNCF. And we're trying to take as much of the burden of the new legislation from them. So in the Environment Act and probably the secondary legislation, all the indication is that the responsibility for BNG sits with the planning authority, but they can outsource that to us. So for example, with the monitoring and compliance aspect of that, we can make sure that that's done well and support them through it, because they don't have that much, well, there's been mention of additional resource that will be given to them, but we don't know what that offer is yet. So yes, support for planning authorities in making this happen is where we're at. Yeah.
I'd just like to make a comment as well. That I've been involved with something called the Climate Leadership Group. I don't know if anybody else has been involved with the Climate Leadership Group in Gloucestershire. So there's a sort of a scrutiny committee that's been set up between all the different local authorities around the impact of climate emergency based on the UK risk assessment for climate emergency on Gloucestershire. And it's really interesting because all of the emergency services, so including fire brigade, NHS, local authorities have done a full risk assessment and have 8 different areas of interest that they're exploring, one of which is food and farming, around how we build resilience for food, for housing, for levelling up, for all those different things. So it's really interesting because there's so much going on that the local enterprise partnership, I mean, I think you're all funded by the local enterprise partnership, aren't you? And seconded from Environment Agency. Rachel's come from a really amazing team in the Environment Agency that was doing the ecosystem evaluations, weren't you, Rachel? But to be aware that this sits within this really extraordinary development of understanding within the local authorities, that we have to act on climate emergency because they've done this analysis of, and sadly there's going to be a lot more flooding in the Vale, there's going to be a lot more drought, we know about all these things, risk to our soils, and that these mechanisms we're trying to align so that when you're not just talking about the local authority about their requirement for biodiversity net gain, but they're thinking that in the context of their other responsibilities that are coming on, and that's all being sort of encapsulated by the county council with their heightened duties that are coming down across all sorts of agendas, and then that's linking into all of these different mechanisms. So why we think it's important for farmers to sort of aggregate and create community projects, that actually build resilience is because you've got all this stuff going on, lots of different funding coming out from national government, lots of different payment mechanisms and opportunities. And really we need to be in a position to receive that investment to become resilient for our soils and our habitats and use some of these mechanisms for that. But I just didn't want you to think that that's sitting in isolation, because it's not. The BNG requirement of the local authorities will have to cut across lots of different agendas. And that, Tanya, going back to your point about a sustainability standard, is that the local authorities will have all this embedded in their statutory duties around the environment. And food provisioning is something that everyone suddenly went, ooh, nobody has a duty for food provisioning, but they're now writing food strategies to make sure that everybody gets fed. And the progression of regenerative agriculture is a way of blending both food and environment. So it's a really interesting scenario and that's why all of this baselining I think is important. So it is just to say that local authorities have got lots of things that they're having to address, and this is just one. But it's linked into sort of wider strategies for our whole county. Any other questions? Yes?
Forgive me because my sums might be wrong, but you've been suggesting about £30,000 per hectare was a rough payment for 30 years. Is that right?
No, sorry, it's at £22,000 to £25,000 per unit, and you might get 3 units per hectare as an average, or 2, so maybe 50,000 or 75,000 or 66,000 per hectare for 30 years.
Thank you, because I wasn't sure it was per unit.
Oh yeah.
Can I ask you, how many units did you have on your holding?
For the Gloucestershire farm, we're at about 71 units, but that's because I wanted to leave some of our productive farmland in that. I wanted to specialise in the areas that I thought were of interest and in need of improvement on the farm. So I've got some quite steep arable land that needs to be in grassland. It's far better for it. That also works particularly well. We're on lighter soils up at Newham. It's good ground, but it's very prone to soil erosion. So putting that back into pasture for 30 years is going to be a fantastic thing to rest that. We've got orchards. We've got an old cider orchard that's in terrible condition, and I only bought the farm a few years ago, so I'm not holding the blame for that one. And that needs restoration. So it's finding the right bits of habitat. So it fits in within my other sort of farming enterprises on there. And there's about another 60 or 70 units again on our farm in Herefordshire on steeper land there that will very much suit a little bit more woodland creation, but taking it back into good quality species rich grassland.
Alex will tell you, there's lots of different carbon platforms, programs, whatever you want to call them, around voluntary carbon that are using, proxy measures around regenerative agriculture to pay people for carbon. Some are quite lucrative, I think, but I think that what's difficult at the moment is the stacking and bundling of all these different opportunities. And I think that's what I find a bit depressing about today. It's just the fact that I'd love to give you more clarity, but you can see that there really isn't that much clarity. But the best way to address that is for us to be able to, or whoever you choose to advise you, is to get that assessment of your farm with somebody who's been tracking all of this, religiously. I mean, I know our team are regularly having updates on these developing opportunities, and we're all learning all the time. But yeah, it is individual choice at the end of the day. And I think that's what you were saying about risk. Is that, it's your appetite for risk. It's whether you're somebody who wants to be a front runner, as I think you said, and or whether you want to wait, and whether you want to go into a 5-year countryside stewardship scheme, because that's going to make everything settle down. Hopefully, in 5 years' time, we've got clarity. It's very, very uncertain, but I think you can make those decisions field parcel by field parcel, linear features, all the things that can give you potentially, BNG baselines or habitat baselines, and the sustainability standards for when you want to, sell those services from your land. So as I say, that's really, I think, where we are. Would you like to make a final comment about anything, Nicholas? Because I think we need to wind up and have some lunch now.
No, it is all evolving, and it's sort of, we have to work with what we've got across both tact and the whole structure of these schemes, and I think we have to see how it develops.
Any final comments?
Only I'd just add, with regards to the carbon credit side of things, bear in mind, particularly if you're selling direct to supermarkets or other large suppliers, this is becoming a really big focus point for them. So be careful about selling off all your carbon credits, because you might well need them as part of your business model, and you may find selling them at the sorts of levels that are being seen at the moment, as Rachel said, they're not very exciting. I wouldn't be looking at selling anything off my farm at those sorts of rates at the moment. So I'd hold on that side and watch how the market evolves. But it could work quite nicely if you're getting paid to create your woodlands now, as Rachel said. By the time they're really sort of getting into their stride and sequestering a large amount of carbon in 30 years' time, when you come out of your BNG agreement, I think they could be worth an awful lot more than they are at the present time.
And Rachel, any final comments?
Just thank you for listening very patiently and bearing with the uncertainty. And if there's any questions that you have that pop up into your head in the meantime, do send me an email, ask them. I'm really happy to talk through.
And just finally to thank Marina for coming. And there's a QR code here if you'd like to sign up for the Global Farm Metric. And as I say, we do hope that you'll be interested in having your farms mapped if you haven't had them mapped already. And get in touch. You have somebody on your team, or our team, on all the tables to help you if you want to have any further information. I hope it's been useful. I feel it's really difficult when we can't give definitive answers about these things. And I think when we're having pre-meetings about this, we actually had a sort of discussion about how we could create clarity when there is no clarity. But I mean, I think at least hopefully what it's done is given you a trajectory, particularly around BNG, about the opportunities coming forward, and it's okay to feel a bit confused. And I would just suggest, if anybody's giving advice at the moment, have really good insurance, because I don't think we can project what is the right thing to do right now. We can only suggest as these things develop, and they will be down to personal decisions and choices made on your land. But I do think you need good legal support, potentially, and good advice. But I think it's been great that Rachel, is here to set up this amazing fund for us in Gloucestershire. Keep all that money in Gloucestershire, and is brilliant to work with. So thank you to all of our speakers for coming. So thank you very much.